June 26, 1944, west of Caen, Normandy. In the damp fields around Saint-Manvieu and the Odin Valley, German observers listened to a sound they thought they already understood. It was the rolling thunder of British artillery, the old voice of the Royal Artillery, the sound that had followed British infantry from the western desert to Sicily, from Italy to the beaches of France. To a German officer trained by years of Eastern Front fighting, it seemed familiar at first. Guns fired, infantry moved, shells walked ahead of the attack. This was war by timetable. This was not new. And yet, in Normandy, the pattern began to look wrong. British guns were not firing only at visible targets. They were not waiting for perfect certainty. They were not treating each shell as a precious single answer to a single enemy position. They were firing to cover ground, to blind machine gun nests, to isolate villages, to break road movement, to pin German infantry below the hedgerows before British riflemen crossed open fields. The Germans saw the volume and thought they understood the weakness. Britain, they believed, was compensating for poor infantry tactics with wasteful firepower. They were only half right. The British Army in Normandy did rely heavily on artillery. Imperial War Museums notes that British attacks often advanced behind rolling artillery barrages, because German defensive skill made movement without suppression brutally costly. The same account explains that Montgomery understood Britain's limited manpower problem and preferred to let metal do what otherwise had to be done by flesh. That sentence explains more than a tactic. It explains a national condition. By 1944, Britain was not the young empire of 1916 with endless battalions to feed into attrition. It was a country fighting a global war at sea, in the air, in Italy, in Burma, and now in France. It had factories, guns, vehicles, trained artillery staffs, and a mature fire control system. What it did not have was unlimited infantry. So when German officers watched British gunners lay down concentrations across orchards, road bends, reverse slopes, and suspected anti-tank positions, they saw extravagance. But British commanders saw insurance. A shell that hit no man could still keep a German machine gun silent. A barrage that destroyed no tank could still delay a counterattack. A smoke screen that killed nobody could still save a platoon. The Germans were counting shells. The British were counting men. The British answer had not been invented in Normandy. It had been learned the hard way, over years of defeats, corrections, and battlefield experiments. In 1940, the British Army had escaped from Dunkirk with courage, but also with a painful lesson. Bravery alone could not solve the problem of German speed. In the desert, the lesson became sharper. German formations were flexible, their anti-tank guns were deadly, and their counterattacks could punish any British movement that arrived without coordination. By the time Montgomery prepared the Eighth Army for the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, British command had begun to understand that the answer was not simply more aggression. It was control. Control meant that artillery could not be scattered in small pieces, each gun serving only the nearest battalion. The Royal Artillery tradition placed enormous value on centralized fire control, so that guns could be massed quickly instead of being wasted in small, isolated efforts. That principle, developed before the war and refined during it, allowed British commanders to concentrate many batteries onto one problem at the decisive moment, rather than letting every unit fight its own private battle. Studies of Allied fire support in Normandy describe this concentration of massive tactical firepower as essential to offensive operations against Germany's skilled defensive system. To German eyes, this could look clumsy. A German officer might see a British barrage falling across a broad front and think the gunners were not precise enough to find the real target. But the British purpose was often not surgical destruction. It was suppression. It was to make the enemy keep his head down at the exact minute British infantry and armor had to cross the killing ground. The Imperial War Museums describes how British attacks in Normandy often relied on rolling barges to suppress German positions, and how dangerous it became when infantry failed to keep close enough to that moving wall of fire. That detail matters because it reveals the logic behind what looked like excess. The shell was not judged only by what it destroyed. It was judged by what it allowed. If a German machine gun stayed silent for 30 seconds, that could be enough for a section to reach a hedge. If an anti-tank crew stayed flat while a Sherman moved past a lane opening, that could be enough to keep the attack alive. If a village was smothered in smoke and high explosive before the assault, the defenders did not need to be dead. They only needed to be late. This was the British calculation, not waste, timing. By the summer of 1944, the British system had become one of the most carefully organized fire support machines in Europe. It was not built around the idea that one gunner should find one target and destroy it alone. It was built around the idea that an entire artillery network could be made to respond as one instrument. A forward observer did not merely ask for a few rounds from a nearby battery. Under British procedure, fire could be escalated through standard concentrations. A Mike target could bring in a regiment. An Uncle target could bring in divisional artillery. Larger concentrations could reach corps or army level, depending on the need and the command structure available. This system allowed British fire to arrive not as scattered noise, but as a controlled weight of metal at the exact point where the battle was beginning to turn. To a German commander, that could still look excessive. A platoon might reveal itself near a hedge line, and suddenly the answer was not a few ranging shots, but a storm from many guns. A suspected forming up area might receive fire before the counterattack had even properly started. A road behind the line might be shelled because it was useful, not because a target was visible on it. The German habit was to ask what the gun had hit. The British habit was increasingly to ask what the gun had stopped. This mattered especially around Caen, where German armored reserves were drawn again and again into the British and Canadian front. Operation Epsom, launched on June 26, 1944, is a good example of this logic. The 15th Scottish Division advanced behind a creeping barrage, and despite difficult weather that limited some air support, the artillery helped the infantry push through the German outpost line west of Caen. The battle did not produce the clean breakthrough British planners wanted, but it forced major German armored formations, including SS Panzer units, into battle on the British front rather than allowing them to move freely against the Americans farther west. That was the deeper result the Germans struggled to measure. British shells were not only buying yards of ground. They were buying time. They were fixing German armor in place. They were making every counterattack slower, more confused, and more expensive. When German tanks tried to assemble, artillery could disrupt them. When infantry tried to move forward in the dark, artillery could split them from their supporting weapons. When commanders tried to read the battlefield, smoke, dust, severed telephone lines, and shell bursts broke the rhythm of decision. So the accusation of waste missed the point. Britain was not trying to win every exchange by destroying every German position. It was trying to make the German system function badly at the moments when it needed to function perfectly. In Normandy, that was often the difference between a failed attack and a survivable advance. But British artillery was not only an offensive weapon. It was also a defensive trap, and this was where many German commanders discovered its most dangerous quality. In Normandy, a German counterattack was rarely allowed to become a clean armored thrust. Before it could gather speed, it had to pass through a landscape already registered by British guns. Crossroads, sunken lanes, village edges, orchard lines, and likely assembly areas were marked on maps before the first tank engine started. The moment a British observer saw movement, the guns did not need to discover the battlefield from zero. Much of the battlefield had already been turned into numbers. That was the hidden power of the Royal Artillery. The Germans often respected British firepower, but they did not always understand the system behind it. A single observer could connect the front line to a wider artillery network, and once that network responded, the German unit being shelled was not fighting one battery. It was fighting a procedure. British artillery methods valued speed, coordination, and neutralization. The purpose was not always to smash a position into silence forever. Sometimes the purpose was to hold it down for 3 minutes, because 3 minutes was enough to decide whether a counterattack arrived as a fist or as broken fingers. This became vital in the repeated battles around Caen. German armored divisions were powerful, but they were also vulnerable while forming, refueling, communicating, and moving along the narrow Norman road system. The Royal Artillery did not need to destroy every Panther or every self-propelled gun to weaken a counterstroke. It could hit the roads that fed it, the villages that sheltered it, and the orchards where infantry waited beside it. Once the timing was damaged, the whole German method began to lose its sharpness. Operation Goodwood, launched east of Caen on July 18, 1944, showed both the strength and the limits of this approach. The British attack opened with one of the largest Allied bombardments of the Normandy campaign. Contemporary accounts describe heavy bomber attacks followed by naval and land artillery fire across the corridor between Caen and Troarn, with hundreds of guns and immense shell expenditure supporting the armored advance. Some German units were stunned, communications were cut, and forward positions were overwhelmed. But the bombing and shelling did not destroy every anti-tank gun on the Bergebus Ridge, and when British armor moved into the open, surviving German guns still exacted a heavy price. That is what makes the British artillery story more serious than simple triumph. It was not magic. It did not remove friction. It did not guarantee breakthrough. But it changed the cost of battle. It allowed Britain to attack with a smaller manpower margin than Germany expected, and it forced German commanders to fight under a constant mathematical disadvantage. Every British barrage said the same thing in steel. If German skill wanted time, it would have to buy that time under fire. By late 1944, the same British method had moved beyond Normandy's hedgerows and into a wider campaign of deliberate pressure. The battles were no longer only about breaking a village line or covering infantry across a field. They were about grinding down the German army's remaining ability to maneuver. In Belgium, the Netherlands, and then on the German frontier, the Royal Artillery became part of a larger Allied machine design to make German defense permanently unstable. This is where the German criticism of waste became even weaker. In the open language of fire plans and ammunition tables, British commanders were not pretending that every shell would kill a man. They knew many would not, but by now that was no longer the test. The test was whether German units could still move, communicate, reinforce, and recover under pressure. If they could not, then the shells had done their work. Operation Veritable, launched on February 8, 1945, in the Reichswald forest near the German-Dutch border, showed this logic on a massive scale. It was conducted by the 1st Canadian Army under Montgomery's 21st Army Group, with British 30 Corps playing a central role. The operation opened with an enormous artillery preparation. Research on the Veritable fire plan records more than 450,000 shells fired, along with over 2 million machine gun rounds, as the Allies tried to crush German positions before the infantry entered the forest. A German officer might have called that excess. But the Reichswald was not a place where tidy maneuver could easily solve the problem. It was dense, wet, mined, defended by experienced troops, and partly shaped by flooded terrain. German positions had to be suppressed before British and Canadian soldiers could move through ground that naturally favored the defender. The artillery was not merely opening the battle. It was trying to remove the defender's first advantage, the ability to wait calmly in prepared cover. Still, even here, firepower did not make the battle easy. The forest fighting remained brutal. Mud, mines, felled trees, and German resistance slowed the advance. That is the honest lesson. British artillery could dominate the opening conditions, but infantry still had to enter the ground. Tanks still bogged down. Engineers still cleared obstacles. Men still advanced yard by yard. But the German system had been forced into a narrowing cage. By 1945, every major defensive position faced the same British answer. Not a single perfect shot, but a planned storm of pressure, time to make resistance disorganized before the assault even arrived. The Germans thought the shells were being spent too freely. In truth, Britain was spending steel to save time, movement, and lives.